What's up, everybody? Nate, Startup Nation, my boy Grant here. Just as another recap with him, Grant owns 7 restaurants, Urge Gastropub, and a variety of others. Over 20 million in revenues a year, so he is no joke. He laughs at that because we just started last episode. We're talking about how he was trying to get tips for $30 a night. So.
Yeah, it's not 20 million in profits. No. Not even close.
He wouldn't be sitting here with me if that were the case. And so with that being said, today on episode 20, we are going to talk about cash flow, cash management, things that are extremely important in both of our industries and in business in general, but specifically lower margin industries that require on economies of scale concept to be successful. And Grant has some pretty cool stories with that. Green Guard does as well. And so pay attention, episode 20. Grant, say what's up.
What's going on, guys?
So with that being said, we were talking about that a little bit last episode, but we talked about when you, your second restaurant specifically, and it was your first as well, you had to basically do some pretty crazy stuff to make sure cash was floated. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll talk about how that looks even at $20 million, even though it's not as important now, but it clearly you still have to manage it. It just because one mistake can be much more costly.
Definitely.
Right?
It's a ripple effect.
It's a ripple effect, and Green Guard's the same way because our payroll isn't $1,000 every 2 weeks now. It's $60,000 a week. Yeah. And so having some issues when it comes to collecting of cash can drastically affect us much worse than it can if you don't. So why don't we start with you and talk a little bit about some of your experiences with these metrics we talked about in 19, how you got to the metrics, like how, because clearly somebody like you is going to have maybe a different take on it, because I've had conversations with other restaurateurs that don't look at it the same way you do. Not to say yours is right or wrong. You and like a David Cohen, some of the people I've talked to, have very similar concepts when it comes to like 6 to 8% of your rent needs to be told to gross, things like that. And then how do you, when you look at these numbers, do you sit down with your partners once a month? We had this conversation with my consultant yesterday, and how does that look?
Yeah, sure. So it was really tough when we first started out because we didn't know what our metrics should be. Part of that has to do with we didn't want to open a restaurant. That's a whole different story. We tried to open up a wine bar that had a couple of food items, and then within 30 minutes of opening, we had an hour wait for a table. Everybody wanted food, and we're like, oh my gosh, we just accidentally opened up a restaurant. So you take all this data and research and pro formas and threw that out the window on opening night, and then we're adapting ever since then. So there's a lot more to that story. I'll tell you sometime. But so it was tough because then all of a sudden, all right, we're adapting on the fly. And one of the things my partners and I have been very good at over the years is pivoting. And you've got to be able to shuck and jive and do whatever it takes to survive. Definitely. If you're one of these guys who says, look, it's my way or the highway as an operator to your guests, you're going to be in trouble. So one thing to say that to your staff, because there are certain things that they have to do in order for everybody to be successful. But people vote with their dollars. So if people are all of a sudden coming in and buying steaks every single night, well, guess what? You just actually opened up a steak restaurant, whether that was your intention or not to. So we definitely adapted with that, but we really weren't sure what the metrics needed to be. So it wasn't until we started getting back our financials after we've been open for a month that we really had something to go off of to look at fine-tuning the business. Now, with a restaurant, one of the advantages to it, and there's not a lot, so keep this in mind, is almost every single vendor you have will give you 30-day terms out of the gate. So as long as you wait until the last possible second to order all of your opening inventory and everything else, you should have somewhere between 15 and 30 days of float just from your vendors to shore up any cash on hand challenges that you may have. So same thing with us. Our hourly staff doesn't start until 7 to 10 days before the restaurant opens for business. I know some restaurateurs who think that's insane, but that's your single biggest expense. And one of the problems that we've always had, and I know is a very common issue for most restaurateurs, is they don't have quite enough cash on hand when they are ready to open as opposed to what they should have. And honestly, even hiring your hourly staff 1 week early can be that extra $50,000 to $60,000 that now is sapped out of your account that you don't have to account for other challenges that you may end up having. So if your restaurant does $200,000 a month in sales, then in theory you should pick up 100,000, possibly even 120,000 in operating capital just from that 30-day float from your vendors from when you first open. So in particular, what we end up doing is we will start the staff training on a Monday, do our friends and family pressure tests on Friday and Saturday of that same week, and then open to the public the following Monday. So then
2 week delay, basically.
Yeah, two week delay, but then you still have, from that time you open, about 10 days of cash coming in before that first payroll run is due. So that's definitely one of the secrets with starting up that is key for cash flow. So that's definitely one of the advantages. That was something that we leaned into hard when we first got open.
Do you ask for a subsidy on rent or some type of
So as you're negotiating your rent, there's a couple different ways you can go. So the most common offers that we have gotten, and every landlord's a little bit different, the most common offers we've gotten have been 0 or very low tenant improvement allowances, but 6 months of rent abatement to do our build out. Now, in retrospect, that was probably about as good of an offer as we could have got as startup operators. Now we're in a position where we're larger, where we can negotiate for either longer abatement periods or even throw out the abatement period altogether and just say, all right, 60 days after we open, then we'll start paying rent, or we'll start paying a certain percentage of what the full rent would be, or something of that nature. Most landlords will push back on that, but if you at least have that as a starting point, you can figure something out. They want to make sure that you're not taking a year to do your build out. They want you open so they can start collecting rent. In theory, they have loans to pay on their spots. They need the cash coming in. And then any kind of tenant improvement allowance you can get is going to be helpful. Even if it's, typically those are issued by square foot. So honestly, even if you get $50 a square foot, it's amazing how fast it can add up. The best offer we've ever gotten was $300 a square foot, and that essentially paid for just about the entire build out, which was fantastic for us. Now, you also have to understand that there's no such thing as a free lunch, or so the saying goes. So the more in TI money you get, the higher your rent is.
It's just numbers. They're just messing with it one way or another, right?
Exactly. So, but as long as you are negotiating a better than market rental rate and have some kind of idea of what your revenues are going to be, then you can find ways to make it work. For us, the metric is you never want your gross rent, so that's including all the triple nets, property tax, all that stuff. You don't want that to be higher than 8% of your revenue. Just because in California, it's very difficult to make any kind of significant money if it's any higher than 8%. We have some of our places that are up around 11%, and those places are doing everything that we can to try to drive revenue so that percentage gets lower. But our most profitable places are running at 4 or 5%, which is great. Every single percentage point you can save there is a percentage point that goes directly to your bottom line.
Well, you're talking about, the average restaurant in the United States is 3.5%. So if you save 2%, you've basically just increased your profit by 40%.
Exactly, it's huge.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's literally what it is.
Yeah. So in a perfect world as an operator, we would pay a certain percent of our revenue each month as rent and be done with it. But unfortunately, 99% of landlords will never go for that for two reasons. One, they need to have the guaranteed cash flow so they can make their loan payments. But two, one of the things we didn't understand for a long time is that the value of buildings or shopping centers is based on their cap rate. Yep. And their cap rate comes directly down to what leases they have under contract. And if there is not a fixed dollar amount per month of rent coming in, then it makes it very difficult for the landlord to get financing for their buildings or purchasing new ones or refinancing or whatever else. So they need to have some kind of dollar figure in there. We've been very lucky that we have a couple of deals that have the landlord has had enough flexibility to give us a straight percentage for at least a certain amount of time. So we have some flexibility as we open and then transition into a fixed rent amount going forward.
Yeah, with us, we were pretty unique here at Green Guard, primarily because it wasn't a large shopping mall property manager type of concept. It's individual owner. Yeah. And so he previously had a company in here that didn't pay for 6 months. And then they had a flood during the period in which it was empty. So he had a ton of issues, and he is an older gentleman, very, very reasonable. And so he just wanted somebody that was reliable and that didn't have the issues, because he's not somebody that has, $40 million worth of assets under his portfolio. This is kind of like his livelihood. And so we negotiated I think it was 2 months abatement plus some TIs plus a 25% off of the first year of rent. We're past all that at this point, but it really helped us, and it's because we showed 4 years of basically zero issues with making our payments. Right. And he's just like, he lost, call it, almost $100,000 in 6 months, and he's just like, it's just not even worth it for the risk, right? For someone that's an individual. So it's a little bit different in our world, but with hardcore fitness, they're very similar to what you're talking about, mind you. Their property manager wants our revenues to justify for some type of investor that they have, making sure we're making our payments on time and all that stuff, which is a lot more of a kind of a structured corporate setting versus Green Guard where it's individual. So.
Right. In a perfect world, you're able to find a building that is individually owned.
It's way easier.
It's way easier. If you go into the bigger shopping malls where there's a Vons or something like that, chances are it is a major private equity firm or even a lot of pension funds from different countries end up buying property up in the United States. So this property we're looking at in Temecula, the deal's not 100% done yet, but is owned by the Queensland Investment Corporation. Really? Yeah, it's the pension fund for in Queensland, Australia. So, but yeah, it's interesting how all this stuff ends up flowing around. But if you have an individually owned building and you can have a one-on-one conversation with somebody, it makes life a whole lot easier. Yeah.
When you were talking about being nimble earlier, it instantly popped. Ashley and I went to Austin last week. We went to this brewery, and I'm spacing on the name. It's called Bangers. And so it's Bangers and like mash type of thing. And they had 101 beers on tap, right? And so big, well known in Texas is very like keep everything in Texas. You probably heard that. Yeah. In fact, I was talking about you to them, and they're like, yeah, good luck having him get his beer in here because we got to keep everybody. And I'm like, whatever. So I was just like, shit, worth asking. The owner was there, so I was bullshitting with him. But then he was pissed because he's like, we had to be nimble because we put the stupid man mug and then a full bottle of champagne with a tiny bit of orange juice, which is like, okay, what's your point? You put a bottle of champagne in a cup, what's your friggin' point? Yeah. And somehow it went viral and got 15 million views. Oh, and all of a sudden this brewery is known for a champagne glass, and he's like, this is bullshit. Like, he's pissed because I
want to sell beer.
It's a pride thing too for him, right? Aside from being a Texan, which they're very prideful people, he's just like, this is some bullshit. So he went from charging $10 for that to $27 for it, and people are still coming. He's just like, well, guess this is what I'm going to be doing.
May as well make some money.
Yeah. And so I was laughing because he's just pissed because guys there's the whole like beer snob thing where people take it too serious, and I get it. The world, it's a very important thing. I mean, you own your own ale works, brewery and all that, but you're also not egotistical about it. But there's a lot of people that are just kind of like just the whole thing, like if you don't know as much as they know, that whole thing, right? Oh yeah. And so you could tell that his staff had a little bit of that in them. So there's just this kind of like this thing, like I don't even want to talk about that, right? But they would have people, and they got to a point where they had to literally put a happy face on the person's hand because it would be like one person ordering it and it'd be an entire bottle, so they wouldn't sell them a second one for liability reasons. So it was really funny how they had to pivot to that scenario, which I thought was instantly what I thought about. So pretty funny.
Yeah, it's the first restaurant was supposed to be a wine bar with a little bit of food, and we had to pivot to a restaurant. Second place, we were supposed to do actually higher end food than the first place would have the beer with it, and we had to pivot hard to go in a different direction with that. Third place, we thought it was going to mostly be a wine shop, which, trying to kind of do the barrel room over again with Brothers Provisions, and then everybody wanted beer to go instead of wine to go, so we had to pivot into that. So, you got to
take the ego out of it, right?
Yeah, you've got to take the ego out of it. We say it all the time, people vote with their dollars. Yeah. So what are people coming into your place and buying? And understand that and embrace it and put your ego aside and just say, all right, this is our thing, and go for it. So
I've had to do that almost a different extreme with Green Guards. We have about 1,500 to 2,000 restaurants. I haven't looked recently that we service, and in all those restaurants, you hear about all the things we want, which is why we have 6 or 7 service lines. But over the last year, I talked to people like you and a bunch of other people that say our apparel company sucks, right? And so inevitably, even though it's nothing to do with what we do, you just get to talking to so many people that own a larger restaurant chains or just friends that are in the industry, and they're just like, I can't even. Because I'll ask them, why does your shirt look like crap? Just messing with them or something. Not even owning an apparel company at the time, right? And they're like, don't even get me started. They wouldn't. And so then I ended up opening an apparel company because of it, which is actually, I did my due diligence, but it's a quite easy thing. It's just that it's one of those industries where you just find kind of a white space that people just historically haven't done a good job from a service side and say, okay, they speak with their dollars, right? Yeah. And so that's what we do to help them out, and it creates a lot more value. So I thought it was pretty funny. to pivot back, funny enough, to the cash management thing. Let's talk a little bit more about the metrics, because that's where we started.
So we thankfully, I had a background in banking in between working for the wine and liquor wholesaler and then getting the restaurants going. And my business partner was a CPA after leaving Vaughn's grocery store and before we get the restaurants going. So we had good financial minds behind us and good skill sets with it. You don't have to have those things, but you do need to have a really strong bookkeeper and you need to have those processes in place. So we took physical inventories at the end of every single month, and we had to have our financials done by the 10th of the following month so we could review them. There's nothing that says you have to have them done by the 10th of the month.
That's just your rule.
But the longer it takes, then the older the data you're looking at is, and the more difficult it is to adjust from there. So a couple things that we found. So for us, food cost needs to be 30% or less. Pour cost needs to be 30% or less. And labor, gross labor, so including all of your taxes, your salary people, everything else has got to be 40% or less. It's crazy how it works, because in order to hit that 40% number, that means we need to run 19% hourly labor. But there's so many add-ons to it. Some of it's a California thing, some of it's just a US thing, but that's your single biggest cost. So for every dollar you spend at most restaurants, 40 cents of it is going back to the staff. So that leaves 60 cents to actually pay for all the overhead, the rent, everything else. So, and the lower we can get each one of those three numbers, again, that's a percentage that goes straight back down to the bottom line. Now, if you cut hourly labor too much, then obviously you have a service issue, and that creates other problems that can affect sales. If you drive your food cost or pour cost down too much, well, then quality starts to suffer. One of the most common things we see in our industry, Claim Jumper, I think, is a good example, where 20 years ago, I remember they opened up the one in Carmel Mountain Ranch, 2-hour wait for a table almost any night of the week. It was insane. Everybody was lining up to go there. They get huge multi-million-dollar, big EBITDA multiple buyout, and the private equity firm, the first thing they try to do is make all their money back in as short a period of time as possible. So they slash labor, slash food cost. So first 6 months, you can make a lot of extra money, and then after that, the quality is down so much people stop coming. We always say that it takes about 6 months for a big change that you do within the restaurant to really have a ripple effect to other people. So we launched a happy hour in San Marcos about 5-6 weeks ago, and it's starting to get some steam, but we know it'll be probably another 3 or 4 months before we really see what the reaction from
the word of mouth and
Exactly. You can market that stuff all you want, and marketing is great from a restaurant standpoint of driving some traffic in right away, but most of those people are coming in to try it once, and unless you execute when they're there, then they've come there one time and they're done, and they'll come back 6 months later. A typical guest will visit the same restaurant twice a year. So you need to have a wide enough reach and a big enough list of people who like your restaurants that you can make the math pencil, assuming that.
So talking about that, since they only go twice a year, what is kind of like the geographic area that you say, okay, this is the density, but then how many people need to be in that area considering it's 2 times a year?
So almost 90% of our guests live within 3.5 miles of us. So that is by far the single biggest draw population density wise. So depending on what your metrics for your individual location are, so let's say you have a 3,000 square foot restaurant. That's an average size mom and pop restaurant. And you are paying $3 a square foot for rent, which is, depending on your neighborhood, that may be a little bit low right now, but it's not too far off from where market is. So great. So your rent is $9,000 a month. So $9,000 a month. In order to have your metric be that 8% of sales, then you do about $110,000 a month in sales. Your average guest spend is going to be about $20 a head. So 110,000 divided by 20. So you need 5,500 customers to go through your door each month. If you figure there's 30 days in the month, that's 183 people that need to come through every single day. So if it's 5,500, so over the course of the year, that's 66,000 people that need to come through. If the average person comes twice a year, that's 33,000 people, different people that need to come to your restaurant a year in order to make your metrics work, assuming you're hitting the rest of the stuff. And again, this is probably to make $3,500 a month. So that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
I remember thinking before we opened up the first restaurant, we had 125 seats. And I'm like, I don't even know 125 people. Yeah. How am I going to fill this place? And in 2007, the internet was around, but it was before social media. So thankfully, we got lucky with word of mouth that within a half hour of opening, we had an hour wait for a table.
San Marcos is like that too. I mean, I remember when you guys first opened, it was like hours.
Oh my gosh, it was absolutely insane, and it's still crazy busy on the weekends. It's normalized a lot, sort of the Monday through Thursday. But so if you're looking at population density, you know that if 90% of your people live within 3 miles or 3.5 miles, that means you need to have at least 30,000 people live within 3.5 miles of where you're at, and that's assuming that every single person likes your restaurant and is going to come twice a year. So just to be safe, you need to be close to 50 to 60,000 people within 3.5 miles to make sure that it's a no-brainer that you're going to hit your metrics.
So if you follow no pressure, right? And if you follow that, the point of that is if you don't go down to that like minute of a level and understand that those metrics, that's why a lot of restaurants fail, right? And then they're not building any type of buffer. So you can't say, okay, well, 30,000. That's assuming every single person goes and comes twice a year, and you guys don't screw up service.
Exactly.
Right. So if you screw up one service, now 10 of those people just found out about how shitty the service is, and now you just lost 11, not 1.
Exactly.
Right?
And when somebody has a bad experience, on average they tell 8 people. Somebody has a good experience, on average they tell 2. So the bad stuff goes viral real fast.
Real fast, right? And that's why it's really important, especially when you open up to make the good first impression. So talk about that as far as managing costs, because there's a lot of restaurants that have the philosophy to overstaff initially, but then you have the issue where, again, you have to worry about cash flow for this. So how do you balance that?
100%. No, it's and this is a very real thing with most restaurants. So you look at the strategy of ordering everything absolute last minute so that you're maximizing that 30-day float from your vendors. And even then, a lot of times you can negotiate longer terms on your opening order with somebody just because they know it's going to typically be much larger than your weekly maintenance orders. So ideally, yes, you want to be overstaffed. You don't want to have servers have 6, 7, 8 table sections on opening night. That is a recipe for disaster. Mm-hmm. So you want them to have 3 to 4 table sections. So be overstaffed, but it's really easy to be overstaffed. We always do 2 pressure test nights or friends and family nights. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of friends and family, key vendors, some of the construction people, some social media influencers and marketing reach, and just anybody we want to say thank you to. We have those people come in to do our pressure tests. We intentionally try to we intentionally try to have each staff member work at least 1 shift of those 2 nights that we do it, and we try to make sure that there's enough people in there to really stress people out. And we tell everybody coming in, look, food's on us. You got to pay for your drinks. That helps us at least have a little bit of revenue coming in. And then the server will still drop the tab for the full amount, even though they're only paying for drinks. And then we always sort of hope that the team gets a couple of tips out of it as well. So it helps offset some of the training costs. So the more stress you can have everybody in during those 2 days when it doesn't count as much, the better off you're going to be on actual opening night. But you really want to push people. And it was crazy with San Marcos. We invited 200 people to our first night, and the place felt empty just because it's so big. And so we ended up having to last second invite an extra 200 people the next night, so we'd have 400 people. But then of course we start doing the math of all the food we're giving away for free, and we're like, oh man, this is like tens of thousands of dollars in free food. So yeah, it was interesting. So
you went from saying, "Oh, I'll give away $4 or $5 grand of food away" to 20,000.
But you need to make sure everybody's exposed during those friends and family nights, so you don't have to overstaff as much when you first open. So some guys will. I've talked with restaurateurs like, "All right, I want 1 table sections on opening night." Well, first of all, your team's not going to make any money because your front of house team's not going to make any money because they only have 1 table that they may turn 2 or 3 times that night, and that's it. So at best, maybe $40 or $50 in tips. Sounds like a lot to most people. people, but for a really good server, that's not much money. And on the other hand, you're so overstaffed that any of that float pickup that you're getting for real, true financial problems that may happen in that first 30 to 45 days, you're now blowing on being ridiculously overstaffed. Instead, try to focus on 3 table sections or 4 table sections. A really good server ought to be able to do a 6 table section for a full service restaurant. So 3 to 4 is still overstaffed at that point.
So you can see those metrics, and then do you guys still religiously sit down on the 10th of every month, or plus or minus, and go over the metrics for all locations, or what does that look like?
So we're running a little bit behind right now. It's April 24th right now. Last night, Zach and I went through the March financials. There's a handful of reasons why they get pushed back 2 weeks this time, but yes, and we do financial reviews with each one of our GMs, so they can see what the metrics are also. Then in addition to that, all of our GMs have to, the Thursday the week before, get all their projections and the schedule for the following week inputted into our cloud drive. And then Zach goes through there to say, all right, well, you have your projection at $50,000 a month, or $50,000 for next week. For the last 4 weeks, you've done $46,000. So why do you think all of a sudden you're going to do 50?
Make them own to it, right?
Exactly. Make them own that projection, and then work backwards from it. So, okay, well, we need 19% labor. So if it's $50,000 is the actual number, then you've got, $9,500 for the week to schedule an hourly labor, in addition to the salary people. We typically do a pretty even split front of house to back of house. Back of house guys make more per hour because they're not collecting tips. Front of house guys are collecting tips. They're all at minimum wage, and go from there with it. The hard part is each one of those GMs knows what it takes to staff their restaurant, but they always want to make things as easy for them as possible, which I get. Like, if you're thick in the weeds and you can think to yourself, oh my gosh, we only had 2 more people here, the owners just don't get it. But we're thinking about other stuff all the time as well. And you can have those 2 extra people on a Friday night as long as you give up somebody on a Monday morning. Yeah. So you got to have
bigger picture stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, that goes back to if you can't measure it, if you can't manage it. If you let somebody write a schedule without a budget, without a projection, you're just asking for trouble.
So I think the key to this episode that Grant points out is have metrics. Every business is going to be different. Make sure if you are not the financial mind like him or his partner Zach are, then get somebody you can trust, right? And at least understand it to a point where you're dangerous, because if you don't, you can be taken advantage of, which we didn't talk about today, but I've heard numerous stories about that. And get a good CPA and bookkeeper. And at that point, and make sure that you're not just always focused on the urgent, and that you sit down and focus on the important task of looking at those metrics every month. It's great to have them, but if you're not then seeing how you measure up against them, kind of pointless.
Absolutely. Can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's one of those mantras that's been beaten in my head over the years, but it's absolutely a thing. Before we opened, we hired a business coach, which we thought was a good idea. Ended up kind of mostly being a waste of money. That's another story for another time. But there are 2 lessons that he taught us that have stuck with us. I don't think we got as much value at it as what we paid him, but his big things were, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And again, the business isn't worth anything, and it doesn't work if it only works when you're there. Again, thinking about what we talked about in episode 19, those the only 3 potential outcomes of a business, you have to be thinking from day one of, how do I make this thing work without me around? Unless you're an owner-operator. I mean, I was the GM at Urge RB for 5 years. But during that time, I knew that I didn't want to be the GM there forever. We wanted to keep growing the company. So I tried very hard to focus on the other 2 salary managers I had and getting them ready to be GMs, so that when I stepped away, it was easy and nothing changed. So.
Yeah, I think that's quite important, and understanding that stuff and then relying on those metrics is absolutely, it's critical to success. And then holding people accountable if they're not meeting them, right? And you're saying if making sure it operates when you can't be there, it's not going to be worth a lot. It's going to be really hard to sell the thing if that's the way you're going to go. Yeah. If it's dependent on you.
Yeah, celebrity chefs have a very difficult time selling their restaurants because first of all, their name's on the building. So what's that going to be like when Emeril Lagasse's not at Lagasse's anymore? Mm-hmm. What does that look like? And also just because you built this cult of personality around you. So you have to think about not being there, and what does that look like?
So that's episode 20, metrics. Make sure you have them, make sure you measure against them, make sure you do it religiously and frequently and on a schedule. Make sure you understand them, and then commit to them. Don't give up on them, commit to them, make sure you hit them, and then make adjustments and be as nimble as possible when business requires you to do that. So episode 20, Grant here, owner of Urge Gastropub. Why don't you give your little 30-second pitch here for your plug? So
the Barrel Room in Rancho Bernardo, Brothers Provisions in Rancho Bernardo, Urge Gastropub, Oceanside, Mason Ale Works, Urge Gastropub San Marcos, the Barrel Room Carmel Valley, and Mason Ale Works Tasting Room and Kitchen in Carmel Valley.
I could have probably said most of those, but I screwed it up. So, so try them out, guys. It's really, really good food. I'm at the one in San Marcos at least once a week, if not twice a week. So I'm far past the only 2 times a year, but it's because it's a good place to be at, especially in North County. So check any of those locations out. I think you really enjoy it. And thanks, Grant, for joining. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Come on out and see us.
Startup Nation, check it out.